Okay, so we are now to chapter 8, lesson 2, and this always seems to be the case, but it's packed full of lots of information here. So we're going to need to move fairly quickly, buckle up, because we're going to be going through a lot of history. That lesson 2 is always full of that. So we kind of begin with this area of Mesopotamia. Right behind me, you can see that poster hanging on the wall there. So Mesopotamia is the Greek word that means the land between the rivers, and we're talking about the Tigris and Euphrates and that area before them. And so about 10,000 years ago, people first started to begin to transition from hunting and gathering to farming. And by farming, they could stay in one spot, and so that gives rise to civilizations. And so Mesopotamia is one of the first civilizations. It's along with the Indus River Valley, ancient China. And they all have these very similar stories of starting around rivers, and there's that transition. Cities can support farming, can support cities, which are going to have a larger population because everybody is not constantly moving around trying to locate food. And so that's really the kind of case of what goes on in Mesopotamia. Because of food, slowly population begins to give rise. And so the Mesopotamian people were, pretty advanced. Some of the names in these areas are like the Sumerians or the Babylonians. Those are names that actually appear in the Bible. So these ancient civilizations. And in fact, like they had a system of laws. We'll see that on the next slide here in a moment. And they invented a form of writing called cuneiform. And they even wrote like this famous story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And an epic is usually this long, drawn out story. So that's a pretty famous thing. And then the Hammurabi Code is also important. And it was a system of laws that was developed. I thought we had a slide on that. Yeah, it's here. So we'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about the Hammurabi Code a little bit more. They were a polytheistic religion in Mesopotamia, and they even built these things called ziggurats that are kind of similar to a pyramid in a lot of ways. There were these stairs that you could access the other levels. And so those are still stand today that you can visit those. Here's a look at what the symbols look like for cuneiform. And then we still have ancient writings where you can find that. So one of the earliest forms of writing by any group, the Mesopotamians, and cuneiform. Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi was a ruler, and this is kind of one of the first evidences. So like as society progresses, you often have to have rules, right? You have to have control. And so they developed these. Now, these are not really the kind of rules that you would want to have. There were like 282 laws, and they're fairly harsh. Like it's not, you go to jail or you pay this fine. It often was, if you cause injury to someone, that same injury is going to be caused to you. So this phrase, like an eye for an eye, kind of comes from the Hammurabi Code. So just kind of really interesting. But it is one of the earliest collections of laws. It would be fairly crude in our way of thinking about it. If I run into someone with my car accidentally and they break their leg, like, would it be really fair that I break my leg now? Like, you'd expect me to pay, maybe for the medical bills and things like that. So obviously we have a different way of approaching laws today, but this is some of the earliest forms of law that existed from the earliest civilizations. Some more videos here that exist that you can watch. I already talked about them being polytheistic. But then we start to transition with Judaism comes on the scene. So it is a monotheistic religion. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in lesson 3, just some of the belief systems of Judaism and some of the holidays that are celebrated. But it's really kind of central in the area of Israel. And so the Israelites are people that practice this religion. It is a monotheistic religion along with Christianity and Islam, which we'll talk about in turn here in a second. The Jewish people are different from Christianity, mainly in that they do not believe, they are expecting and waiting on a Messiah. A Messiah is basically a savior, a redeemer of people. They believe that that's still waiting to occur. Christianity, which would come out of Judaism, believes that that has already occurred through Jesus. So there's it's interesting in that Christianity came out of Judaism, but yet they're central figures that are in both places. So the Torah is the Old Testament, is part of the Old Testament, and it is the first half of the Christian Bible. So that Torah is what's read, and really there's even the first 5 books of the Bible, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Those 5 books are like the most essential readings for Jewish people. So I think all of the Old Testament is important, but that is especially like the book of Exodus and Genesis, which tells the story of Abraham. He's considered the father of the Israelite people. So some of those names, like Abraham, shows up in Christianity. He shows up in Islam as well. So there are some connections between those. Christianity, as I already said, forms out of that, really surrounding the person of Jesus. He was a Jewish teacher, so he was raised practicing Jewish customs, and then ultimately he made statements about himself being the Son of God, and that is something that got him in trouble with the Jewish people at the time. He would be executed through crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. It's kind of a complicated story to kind of go through too much of that detail, but ultimately he is the founder of Christianity. His followers believe that he was raised from the dead in a supernatural kind of event, and that he kind of ascended into heaven and is waiting, and Christians are waiting on his return. So there's obviously a lot packed into Christianity and Judaism, and we can't kind of dissect all of that, but just kind of know that Jesus is considered the founder and the central figure in Christianity. So Jesus led to the rise, and it really will become a religion that dominates much of Europe later on. So Islam starts around 600 CE, so about 600 years after the time of Christ. There's a guy named Muhammad, and he is visited by an angel named Gabriel, also appears in the Bible, and received these revelations, and he wrote those down in a collection of writing called the Quran. And Muhammad is considered the last and the greatest of the prophets. In fact, Jesus is considered a prophet in Islam as well. Like, they respect him, they regard him, but just making claims about him being the son of God, that's not something. So there is some similarities, but Christians are not Muslims and Muslims are not Christians. So there is a difference there. But they do share some similarities. Like, all 3 of those religions are monotheistic religions. And they all kind of recognize Abraham as a central figure as well. So Muslims read the Quran. Some other things about Muslims is that they have these 5 pillars, these 5 things that they must do. They have to pray 5 times a day facing the city of Mecca, which is a holy city in Islam. And so I actually saw this a couple of years ago in a parking lot in Bloomington. So someone got out of their car and it was time to pray. So they turned and they faced. So if you're here in Indiana, you would face east. That would be where you would go to Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. And then there's a repetition of things that they pray. So they have to pray different times, like sun up, sundown, maybe at noon. I don't know all of them. But that's one of the pillars. You have to fast during the month of Ramadan, which changes throughout the year. And that doesn't mean you fast like you don't eat for 30 days, but they don't eat between sunup and sundown. So you have to eat breakfast before the sun goes up, and you cannot eat dinner until the sun goes down. You're supposed to be charitable by giving aid to the poor. And then one time in your life, you are supposed to make a pilgrimage, which is called the Hajj. And that is a traveling to the holy city of Mecca and spending time there, usually I think they usually go during the month of Ramadan, I believe. So those are kind of like the chief things. The Quran is written in Arabic, and they refer to God as Allah. Don't really use the term God. They don't use other terms. So those are kind of some of the key principles. We'll talk about some of the other key ideas of Islam and the different types that exist today. After Muhammad's death, Islam expanded across most of Southwest Asia. His successors were called caliphs. And then we start to transition into a kind of a change of time. And really one of the things that's interesting is that Islam goes through a stage of like prosperity, and they call it the golden age of Islam. These are kind of really showing its expansion, the spread of Islam. Yeah, so it's right here. And Islam today very much has a rejection of a lot of things. For example, in Islam, if you would go into a mosque, there is no human form shown in any art. So like very, very different from Christianity. You might see a statue of Jesus, or in a Catholic church, you might see a statue of Mary, or maybe the crucifixion shown. In Islam, they do not show this. There's a lot of rejection of certain things, very modest dress. So we probably classify Islam as a very conservative religion. Interesting enough, kind of around this period of 700 to 1300, there's the golden age of Islam. They brought in like and advanced a lot of science, and really it just kind of different than what I think of kind of like the Islamic State today, I guess. And I don't mean that in any disrespectful way at all, but it's very different that they were kind of like constantly expanding, learning new ideas, advancing things in fields of like algebra. Algebra is an Arabic word kind of created by throughout this time of the golden age of Islam. So that advanced, this is the architecture that exists in, that's like Islamic architecture. I think that video is wanting to play. We're going to skip past that. Sorry. So one of the other things that we have to kind of acknowledge here is that during this period of time, 1100, 1200, there was the Crusades. And you probably learned about these last year. Really kind of dark period of history of really religion clashing, but Christians trying to reclaim the Holy Land, which is this area of Israel, because that's where Jesus was at. Not really a great time. And then in the middle of the 1200 CE, the Mongols kind of conquered Southwest Asia. So they're kind of in control of part of that. Soon after, the Ottomans kind of take control, and the Ottomans were kind of from the area. The Ottoman Empire is like what is modern day Turkey. So they began around 1200. They were mainly Islamic, but different from the people that controlled the rest of Southwest Asia. And the Ottoman Empire was huge. So at its height, you can see kind of the vast amount of territory that it owns. But there's a decline with the Ottoman Empire because they were involved in World War I, and they were on the side of Germany, and Germany loses. So what happens is the Ottoman Empire basically falls apart at the end, and they lose much of their territories. In fact, the country of Turkey is formed out of the end of the war, and it kind of talks about that right there. So the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and Turkey is formed as a country. Britain and France kind of gained control of a lot of that territory because they were the winners in World War I. And they really didn't pay any attention to the cultural boundaries that existed in this area, which is not great, right? Like if you come in and you're like, we're going to put you and you together, and those people are culturally different or don't get along, that's a problem. And so what's going to happen here is that there's going to be just cultural conflicts, and that's going to lead to war from now until present time. Like there's tensions in Israel today between Arabs, between Jewish people. Israel is in a constant state of fighting often. So like there's just a lot going on there. This is an interesting building. This is called Hagia Sophia. It is one of the largest cathedrals in the world. It was a Byzantine church at one time, and then it changed to a mosque, and today I think it's just a museum, but it is massive. It stands above the city of Istanbul, Turkey. Really fascinating place, huge tourist place in Turkey. So I thought I'd point that out. So another thing that happened with territory being received is that the British received this territory of Palestine. And Palestine was mainly being lived in by Arabs, but it was kind of like sacred territory to Jewish people. And so there becomes kind of this war over who should have control. So the Jewish nationalists called for the reestablishment of the historic homeland in Palestine. So there becomes kind of this conflict over the area of Palestine. This kind of moves into just talking about the Jewish struggle with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. That is a phrase that basically means when racist tendencies that exist towards people of, and we got to distinguish here, both people of Jewish faith, but also Jewish ancestry. So like it's both. When you're mainly talking about the Holocaust, you're talking about a lot of people that it could be one or the other, but anti-Semitism is really a racism, hostility, prejudice towards Jewish people, either in race or in faith. So the Holocaust was atrocious. You talk about it briefly in 6th grade. We're kind of revisiting that here since we're covering Judaism. And so about 6 million Jewish people died at the hands of Nazis. They were kind of systematically executed, gas chambers, prison camps. You've probably heard of places like Auschwitz that existed. Horrific. Maybe you've heard of Anne Frank, who was a Jewish girl that lived during this time, and she was a Holocaust prisoner and would ultimately die in a prison camp. So really, really tough. We're going to watch a video about the Nazis and why they did this, but they were like, after trying to develop a superior race of people that rejected any Jewish influence. So that's the reason it talks about people like other people with physical or mental disabilities, people of like homosexuals. They were often persecuted and often usually just executed. So just an atrocious time in history. These are definitely good videos about survivors of the Holocaust. Sorry, those videos were wanting to play and I wanted to move past that. So again, we talked about this area of Palestine. So you can see that on the map here. And there was, the United Nations got involved with trying to decide what to do about it. So the area of Palestine, we might investigate that a little bit more in class. Just kind of really a difficult situation there. So again, this just talks about areas like the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, which were areas that both the Arabs and the Jewish people were kind of fighting over, like who would have control. Oh, and we should acknowledge this. So on its Independence Day, the Jewish state of Israel is invaded by other Arab countries. And this is going to create a lot of refugees that existed, and that would eventually end in a truce in 1948. So, but just even in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of tension between these areas. You can kind of see this is kind of what things look like today. The Gaza Strip was returned to Palestine, which is mainly an Arab area, in 2005. The Sinai Peninsula was returned to this area here, was returned to Egypt. So just all of this is kind of a mess made by the way boundaries that were set up at the end of World War I by Britain and France. So long-term effects of, not really thinking through things, or when foreigners are making the decisions for people. We already kind of talked about numerous conflicts in different places, whether it's, civil wars in Afghanistan, ethnic groups fighting in Turkey. And that's kind of what the slide is talking about here. And then as we move into more modern times, there was the Iranian Revolution that occurred. The Iraq and Iran fought a war in the 1980s. And then Saddam Hussein invades the country of Kuwait to take control of. Kuwait is small, but super rich in oil, and they were trying to take control of that. And so the United States comes to their aid, and this causes the first Persian Gulf War. And the U.S. frees Kuwait from that control. And I don't think, then we have September 11th, the events of that, which were led by Al-Qaeda, which was a terrorist organization, really kind of in a variety of areas, but really kind of the Taliban was responsible, and that was out of Afghanistan. So they were ones responsible for that. And that kind of brings in the war on terror that happens, which is kind of mainly in Afghanistan and trying to find many of these terrorists who are living kind of like off the grid and hard to find. So that's that. And then finally, the second Persian Gulf War was fought in 2003, and Saddam Hussein was still in power even after the first Persian Gulf War. And so at this ends kind of differently. He is kind of like arrested eventually by his own people, tried. He's eventually executed. So here they are removing the statue of him, and his dictatorship ended in Iraq. So there's lots of conflict that exists in this region. So I've got two slides here just to kind of wrap things up. These are kind of like there's this one and then there's this one here, and you need to write down these things. So we kind of start back in the time of Mesopotamia, 10,000 years ago. People kind of transition from hunting and gathering to farming. This gives rise to civilizations like Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is famous for many innovations, including the writing form of cuneiform, which is what the Epic of Gilgamesh is in. We then talked about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which all three are monotheistic religions. And then Jesus was a Jewish teacher, so Christianity became about because of his teachings. And yeah, so you could pause right here and you could write those things down. And then I'm going to move on to this slide right here. So we've got one more set of information here. So the Ottomans conquered Mesopotamia and Persia in 1200, and then they held control of this area until World War I. And that's when Britain and France divided up the Ottoman Empire, creating boundaries without really thinking about the ethnic backgrounds of the people. Turkey was an area created out of some of that Ottoman Empire. One of the Southwest Asian mandates territories received by the British was Palestine, and we've already talked about that was an area of a lot of fighting and control between the Arabs and the Jewish people. And I think maybe I kind of skipped this in the slide. Let's go back. I'm pretty sure it's in here, the Arab Spring. I'm getting confused, and this is actually in lesson 3. Yeah, so don't want to make this go on a lot longer, but I think maybe in section 3, we will talk about the Arab Spring, which is a little bit more recent event. Oh, here it is. Yeah, in 2010, there was a popular uprising, and we might talk about this in the third section, but you can kind of go ahead and fill this in here. So the Arab Spring was a series of pro-democracy protests that existed in North Africa and Southwest Asia. And then finally, the first Persian Gulf War was fought when Iraq invades Kuwait, and the United States comes to the aid of Kuwait to liberate them. So that's a lot packed into one section, I know. Section 2 is always that way, and there's just a lot going on here with 3 religions, some major conflicts that have existed, some ancient civilizations. So thanks for watching, and we'll wrap it up here. Please write down those key things for your notes.